What if the United States unleashed its most devastating non-nuclear weapon against the cartels? A weapon so powerful that entire compounds vanish in a single blast, leaving nothing but silence and ash. For years, whispers of covert missions and secret raids have surrounded the U.S.-Mexico border. But now, something much bigger is unfolding, an operation unlike anything seen before. Behind the headlines and political speeches, an invisible war has been raging. Elite U.S. units, working quietly alongside select Mexican forces, have been crossing the border under the cover of night. Their mission? Hunt down cartel leaders, dismantle drug labs, and sever trafficking routes before shipments ever reach U.S. soil. These were not operations splashed across the evening news. They were ghosts, surgical strikes that left cartel bosses missing, labs destroyed, and territories shaken. And yet, almost no one ever heard about them. In public, Mexican authorities claimed the victories. In private, U.S. agents risked everything. Cartel leaders grew paranoid, unsure how their most trusted strongholds were being penetrated. In retaliation, bounties were placed on anyone suspected of working with American forces. Quietly, some U.S. operatives lost their lives, erased from the battlefield without ceremony. But as dangerous as these missions were, they were just the beginning. Because the cartels are about to face something far worse, an escalation that could change the entire balance of power. The turning point came with a single decision. Just weeks after taking office, the new U.S. administration officially reclassified 8 of Mexico's most powerful cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. On paper, this looked like politics. In reality, it was a declaration of war. That label changed everything. Cartels were no longer just organized crime groups. They were treated as global threats on the same level as Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And with that shift in power came new powers. Suddenly, U.S. military units weren't bound by the same restrictions. The Navy, the Air Force, and even covert counterterrorism teams were granted expanded authority to strike, not just to intercept drugs, but to eliminate targets. The CIA moved quickly. Surveillance drones began circling high above Mexican territory, recording every shipment, every convoy, every hidden lab. What cartels once believed were safe zones turned into open maps for American intelligence. Each movement was tracked, each signal traced, and slowly the net tightened. But this was only the surface. Behind closed doors, discussions were already underway at the highest levels: the White House, the Pentagon, senior intelligence agencies. Reports hinted at something larger: direct drone strikes against cartel leaders, convoys, and underground labs. Not just raids, but precision attacks from the skies. Even the Mexican government, though hesitant to admit it publicly, was reportedly aware of what was being prepared. And yet, the cartels had no idea just how far the U.S. was willing to go. Because this wasn't just about drones, it was about deploying weapons that most of the world hoped would never be used again. For decades, cartels have feared helicopters, snipers, even the relentless watch of American drones. But none of those compare to the weapon now looming over them, a weapon so destructive it's often called the closest thing to a nuclear strike without crossing the nuclear line: the vacuum bomb. Also known as a thermobaric weapon, the vacuum bomb doesn't work like a traditional explosive. Regular bombs carry both the fuel and the oxidizer they need for combustion. But the vacuum bomb is different. It steals oxygen directly from the air around it. When released, it disperses a massive cloud of highly volatile fuel particles. Then, with a second charge, it ignites the cloud in an instant. The result?
temperatures hotter than molten lava, a crushing pressure wave that collapses walls, bunkers, even caves, and perhaps most terrifying of all, an invisible aftermath where oxygen vanishes, leaving anyone within range gasping for breath before the shock wave even reaches them. Military analysts describe the impact in chilling terms. Unlike a standard blast that shatters outward, a vacuum bomb's explosion lingers, pulling in air, crushing everything caught inside its radius. Fortified drug labs hidden deep in jungles, obliterated. Cartel compounds buried under concrete and steel, reduced to rubble. And the scale can be staggering. These bombs come in many forms, from small handheld devices carried by soldiers to massive warheads like Russia's so-called father of all bombs, which produces a fireball equal to 44 tons of TNT. The United States has its own versions, refined over decades of secret development. For the cartels, this isn't just another threat, it's a nightmare. Because against the vacuum bomb, there are no tunnels deep enough, no walls thick enough, no hideouts safe enough. But to truly understand why this weapon inspires such fear, we need to go back in time, back to the first wars that gave birth to the idea of creating firestorms out of thin air. The terrifying power of vacuum bombs didn't appear overnight. Their roots stretch back more than a century to the First World War. In 1914, German forces began experimenting with incendiary shells, crude weapons filled with tar-soaked tissue and gunpowder dust. When they detonated, they spewed burning fragments in every direction, igniting the battlefield and suffocating soldiers trapped inside trenches. By World War II, German scientists had gone even further. Under the guidance of Austrian physicist Mario Zipper, research into fuel-air explosives, the early ancestors of today's thermobaric bombs, began taking shape. The concept was simple but horrifying. Replace traditional gunpowder with a fuel cloud that could consume an entire space in one devastating ignition. But it wasn't until the Vietnam War that the technology truly evolved into something usable. In 1971, the U.S. introduced the CBU-55, the first operational thermobaric bomb. It was tested on the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, carried by attack aircraft like the A-37 Dragonfly and the A-1 Skyraider. Pilots dropped canisters that floated down on parachutes before releasing massive propane clouds, which were then ignited mid-air. The effect was shocking. Dense jungle clearings erupted into firestorms, bunkers collapsed instantly, and oxygen was ripped from the air. In one rare combat deployment, a single CBU-55 was dropped from a C-130 transport plane over North Vietnamese forces. The blast consumed an area the size of 4 football fields. An estimated 250 soldiers perished, not from burns or shrapnel, but simply because the explosion devoured the very air they needed to survive. After the Vietnam War ended, the technology was quietly refined. Newer versions like the CBU-72 were stockpiled, and during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, fuel-air explosives were used once again to clear Iraqi bunkers and fortifications. Each time, they delivered a chilling reminder. These weapons weren't just destructive, they were psychological, breaking the will of anyone unlucky enough to survive. The sheer horror of thermobaric weapons didn't go unnoticed. In 1980, nations like Mexico, Switzerland, and Sweden pushed for a UN ban, calling them too brutal for modern warfare. But the motion failed. Too many powerful militaries wanted to keep them in their arsenal. And so, the vacuum bomb remained, a weapon whispered about, rarely seen, but always feared. And as the decades passed, it didn't disappear, it only grew stronger. because the next chapter of this weapon's history wouldn't be written in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the dark caves of Afghanistan.